The Super Nintendo is truly one of the all-time best libraries when it comes to co-op gaming. So it's about time we talk about co-op Super Nintendo games. The first game I want to talk about is called Lamborghini. This game in and of itself is nothing special, it's just a standard racer. But what makes it stand out is that there is a hidden co-op mode. If you plug in the Super Scope, you're actually able to play this with a friend, where one player is driving and the other player is able to shoot the other cars. The gameplay doesn't get much more deep than that, but it's just such a unique experience that I definitely just wanted to mention it. When it comes to co-op gaming, I think this one is underrated. Cacoma Night in Bizyland is another often overlooked co-op game on the Super Nintendo, and this one is a puzzle game, very similar to Kicks, but with an anime art style. You're able to play it in two-player co-op. You basically just avoid the enemies, and you want to draw lines and make various squares to uncover the picture. The gameplay is pretty simple, but this game quickly becomes addicting, especially when playing with a friend. If you haven't played Cacoma Night in Bizyland, give it a shot. Totally a hidden gem. Joe and Mac 2, Lost in the Tropics, is actually the third game in the Joe and Mac series after Joe and Mac and then Congo's Caper. I don't know what that's about. But the point being is this is another great 2D platformer with co-op, and this one came out exclusively on the Super Nintendo. It doesn't really add a whole lot new to the genre or the series, but if you're a fan of the Joe and Mac games, you'll definitely like this one as well. Super Ninja Boy is a co-op RPG that mixes in beat-em-up gameplay. In the US, on the NES, we had Little Ninja Brothers, and there were other games that came out exclusively in Japan under the title Super Chinese. So this is the 16-bit continuation of that series. It has the same top-down open-world areas with random battles that turn into beat-em-up gameplay. Every time you win a battle, you gain experience points and can level up your characters. This is truly a co-op RPG, which is definitely a rarity for the time. If you haven't played Super Ninja Boy, give it a try. Firepower 2000 is a vertical scrolling shoot 'em up. It was also known as Super Swiv in Europe, I believe. This game came out in 1992, so it's an early Super Nintendo release. You play as a helicopter and a jeep, which is a cool combination because each player has different abilities. The helicopter can't be stopped by obstacles, and the jeep can fire in any direction. So it makes the gameplay a little bit varied, and you can work together using your unique traits to better fight the enemies. Biker Mice from Mars is a isometric racing game based on the pretty much forgotten cartoon series of the same name. This is kind of like Mario Kart, but from an isometric view and on bikes, I guess. But this actually works pretty well as a co-op game. You can work against each other, but when I play this, I like to team up, and as long as one of you places in the race, you can both move forward onto the next race. And you can work together by getting power-ups and shooting down the various enemies. Just try to avoid the friendly fire. This is one of my favorite co-op racing games. When it comes to licensed games, it's kind of a mixed bag, but Power Rangers the movie is definitely one of the better ones. It's a side-scrolling action game. Kind of plays like a beat-em-up, but it doesn't have the same freedom of movement. You can just go left to right. And I like that you start out in your civilian persona, and then once you fill up your morphing meter by picking up Thunderbolt-shaped items, then you're able to transform into your Ranger mode. And when you're in this mode, you have a powered-up kick as well as a unique weapon for each character. So this definitely changes things up and adds some variety to the gameplay. But overall, this is a really excellent game that I think was often overlooked, just because a lot of Power Ranger games don't have a great reputation. To me, I think this is the best one. Fire Striker is kind of a mix between a Breakout clone and an action RPG, which sounds like a weird combination, but it works surprisingly well. It has some really nice pixel art that kind of reminds me of A Link to the Past. But basically there's a fireball that bounces around and you use your swords to hit it where you need it to go. This is how you attack enemies and break down walls. One player plays as the goalie character, where they need to basically just guard the goal. The other player plays offense and is going around moving up and down and doing most of the damage here. Luckily, the second player isn't just stuck to the bottom. They are able to move around a bit as well. And there are some really cool boss fights here. Fire Striker is another one that I don't hear a lot of people talk about. The Super Nintendo version of Sunset Riders is an excellent port. Unfortunately, it wasn't able to include the 4-player gameplay, but everything else is intact. It still has the really impressive, colorful visuals, as well as the fast-paced run-and-gun action. There's also a version on the Sega Genesis, but I think it's pretty well known that the Super Nintendo version is the better port, and that's the one that I played the most. Darius Twin is a horizontal shoot-'em-up that came out exclusively for the Super Nintendo. It has very similar gameplay to the arcade games, but some slightly different features. Most notably are some of the power-ups. But it's very difficult. Each player has their own separate lives, but there are no continues. Definitely one of the best shoot-'em-ups on the Super Nintendo. Battletoads in Battlemania is the follow-up to the original Battletoads on NES. This has a lot of the same gameplay, but I feel like this one is a little bit more approachable. It's not one of the most difficult games of all time, like the original. At least I was able to get quite a bit further than I ever could on the NES game. You still have the powerful attacks, where your character morphs into various different objects and knocks the enemies back. But like the original, it also has gameplay that changes up. Of course, it has the foundation of being a beat-em-up, but it also has some other sections. This game might not be as memorable as the original Battletoads, but it might be the better game. Saturday Night Slam Masters is basically a 2-on-2 wrestling game that pretty much plays like a fighting game. You're able to play through the entire story in 2-player co-op, doing 2-on-2 battles. This is one that I didn't even know about when I was a kid. I found out about this game as an adult. It's also a great 4-player game, where you could do free-for-all matches or 2-on-2 with some of your friends. Smash TV is a port of the arcade game. I primarily played this game on the NES. It works much better as a Super Nintendo game, as having 4 buttons, you can actually play this like a twin-stick shooter, which is the way this game is intended to be played. If you don't know Smash TV, basically it's a single-screen twin-stick shooter, where you just shoot down all the enemies. Once you clear the room, you move on to the next one. It doesn't get much more complicated than that. Of course, there's a lot of challenge here, but playing it with a friend is definitely the way to go. The King of Dragons is a Capcom beat-em-up that originally came out in 1991 in the arcades, but was finally ported to the Super Nintendo in 1994. This is kind of similar to Golden Axe, where it's a beat-em-up but with weapons. But the main thing that sets it apart is it actually has some RPG elements. Defeating enemies and picking up gold count towards experience points. And then of course your characters can level up and increase their stats. This is definitely one of the best beat-em-ups on the Super Nintendo. The Great Circus Mystery, starring Mickey and Minnie, is another excellent 2D platformer. This also came out on the Sega Genesis. What I love about this game is the variety in gameplay. You get various costumes that provide different abilities, so between levels, gameplay is always changing up. Sometimes you get a vacuum, where you can suck up the enemies and turn them into coins, and you could get the safari suit, which allows you to climb on walls and swing from hooks. And then you get the cowboy suit, which you could shoot and bounce, I guess. This is a great pick up and play that you could beat in one sitting. It's not too difficult. Super Bomberman 3 never came out in the US, but it did come out in Europe, which was also called the Super Nintendo. I am going to include it. Bomberman is primarily known for the multiplayer gameplay, but I think it's kind of overlooked when it comes to co-op gameplay. A lot of these games include really great cooperative gameplay as well. Super Bomberman 3 is no exception. It has all the standard Bomberman gameplay where you go through puzzles, blow stuff up, try to eliminate all the enemies, and then move on to the next stage. But this one also introduced these animals that you could ride, kind of like a Yoshi, and that definitely changes up the gameplay. There's also some really cool boss fights. To me, this is my favorite Super Bomberman game. Knights of the Round is another Capcom arcade game that was ported to the Super Nintendo, and this one is pretty similar to King of Dragons. You have weapons, it has the RPG elements, and it's a beat 'em up. But I just found this game to be the better game. As you level up, your characters will automatically be upgraded with new weapons and armor. Knights of the Round is another excellent beat 'em up on the Super Nintendo. Zombies Ate My Neighbors is just one of the all-time classic Super Nintendo games, and a standout when it comes to co-op gameplay. Basically, it's a top-down run-and-gun shooter, but there's a lot of exploration. You're going around trying to save all of the neighbors, and then you can move on to the next level. This game is incredibly 90s. Just look at these characters. I always really loved the horror theme of this game as well. The only downside I think for this game is it's incredibly long and difficult. I have never been able to beat it, but it's definitely on my bucket list of games to beat. Still, I think Zombies Ate My Neighbors is just one of the best co-op games of all time. Another excellent top-down run-and-gun shooter is Pocky and Rocky, but this one is set in feudal Japan. This is another game that's really difficult, but with some practice, it's not impossible to beat this game. This just has some excellent gameplay, really great visuals, and some really interesting boss fights. Pocky and Rocky is just truly one of the best Super Nintendo games. Super Double Dragon is the Double Dragon game that only came out on Super Nintendo. Up until this point, basically every Double Dragon game was a port of the arcade games. So it was cool to see a game made specifically for the Super Nintendo. And this just works out to be a really great beat 'em up. The controls might be a little bit weird and take some getting used to, but once you get the hang of it, it actually makes sense. I love the variety of weapons. You can now get nunchucks and a bow staff. This is another game that's pretty difficult, but if you have a good teammate, you should be able to get through it in a few attempts. Donkey Kong Country 2, in my opinion, is the best of the Donkey Kong Country series. Primarily because you get to play as Diddy Kong and Dixie Kong, which those are my two favorite characters. Specifically Dixie Kong because she's able to glide with her hair. This is an incredibly difficult 2D platformer, but the music is absolutely amazing. Just listen to some of these songs. Truly just some of my favorite video game music ever. Like all of the Donkey Kong Country games, this includes a tag team mode, so you don't specifically get to play simultaneous co-op, but at least you're both in a level at the same time. So you gotta be alert at all times, and you can switch between players on the fly. I think this is one of the best 2D platformers of all time. The Legend of the Mystical Ninja was the first entry in the Goemon series to make it to the US. And this is a really great game. It's a mix between 2D platforming with some top-down Zelda-like sections as well. This works really well as a co-op game. In the platforming sections, you are able to jump on your partner's shoulders for some of those more tricky areas, so you don't have to jump in sync. That being said, this is truly one of the most difficult co-op experiences I've ever had in my life. Me and my brother dedicated hours playing this game, and we finally were able to beat it. Some of these later levels are punishingly difficult, at least in my experience. But that being said, it's still one of my favorite co-op Super Nintendo games. Wild Guns is an excellent Cabal shooter. If you don't know what a Cabal shooter is, it takes place in third person and you move side to side, avoiding all of the enemy fire, while simultaneously using a cursor to shoot the enemies. So it takes a little bit of getting used to, but once you can wrap your head around it, this control scheme is actually pretty effective. Again, this is just an excellent co-op game. Like a lot of these games, it can get really difficult. The visuals are great here, the gameplay is incredibly polished, there's a lot of detail in the environment and the bosses. Run Saber is a top-tier co-op Super Nintendo game that is often overlooked. It plays a lot like Strider, but co-op. It's basically a 2D platformer with a lot of action. You're able to climb on the walls and the ceiling. I always found that part to be pretty fun. There's not a lot of exploration. You don't just go left to right. Luckily, there is a little arrow that kind of shows you where you need to go. You also have a screen clearing special ability. The level design here is just a lot of fun, with some really interesting boss fights. I think more people are finally catching on to Run Saber, but it might still be an unknown game. So if you haven't played it, give it a try. I can't recommend it enough. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Turtles in Time is truly just one of the best beat-em-ups of all time. Has some pretty straightforward beat-em-up gameplay, but even though it's simple, I think they perfected it with this game. And some even preferred the Super Nintendo port to the arcade original. I've always loved the music of this game. The visuals are beautiful, and being able to throw the enemies into the screen was just such a cool thing to see back in the day. Again, yeah, Turtles in Time, just truly one of the best games ever. Kirby Superstar is a game that's near and dear to my heart. I played this game for countless hours on my Super Nintendo with my little brother back in the day. And to this day, it's still just my favorite Kirby game of all time. I believe it was the first Kirby game to include co-op gameplay. It introduced the helper character. So basically, Kirby, when he copies an enemy and turns into that power-up, you're able to then convert that power-up into a helper character, and player 2 can take control of them. This adds a lot of variety to the gameplay. Not only can Kirby take on any ability, it gives you the opportunity for the second player to pretty much just change characters at any time. If you see a new enemy that you want to try out, it's pretty simple to convert it to a helper. Again, I'm going to be saying this a lot for this list, but this is just one of the best co-op games of all time. Final Fight 3 is a Final Fight game that came out specifically for the Super Nintendo. Just like Super Double Dragon, it's cool to see that this game was built for the console, and I think it's definitely the best in the series. The combat has a lot more depth. You're able to pull off Street Fighter button combinations to do some pretty cool moves here. There's also branching paths. And if you don't have a friend, you can actually let the AI take control of player 2, which is cool, I guess. I personally think this is one of the best classic beat-em-ups ever, and it is the best in the Final Fight series. Contra 3: The Alien Wars, another game specifically made for the Super Nintendo. This should surprise no one to see this game on the list, as it's still just one of the best run-and-gun shooters of all time, and often considered the best in the Contra series. Basically took everything that was good about the NES games and just upgraded it and improved upon it and brought it into the 16-bit world. It has the same great run-and-gun gameplay, but with some really impressive visuals. They fully took advantage of the Mode 7 here in some of these levels. And a lot of people hate on these top-down sections, but I think it's kind of ahead of its time. Being able to rotate the screen with the L and R buttons, maybe people couldn't wrap their head around that back in the day, but I think it actually feels pretty good right now. Anyway, I totally suck at these games. I've always been bad at Contra games. I've never been able to beat them without cheat codes, but that doesn't mean I don't love them. Okay, now here's a game that might surprise some of you for being so high on this list, but I stand by this. I'm talking about Goof Troop. Yeah, I personally think this is one of the best co-op games of all time. It's pretty much a Zelda clone that can be played in co-op, although it's level-based and it doesn't quite have the same depth of gameplay, but has similar puzzles. But there is some unique gameplay going for it as well. You never have a standard weapon. When playing in 2-player, you each have an item slot, so you gotta work together on picking up which items you'll need. But to fight the enemies, all you can do is pick up barrels and rocks to throw at them. Goofy is stronger and can take out the bigger guys with one barrel, and Max is faster, so he could run through some of the more difficult sections to get through the door quicker. You're definitely gonna need to strategize between the two of you, using your unique abilities to figure out how to get through the levels effectively. This game's pretty short, and it's really not too difficult. I've been able to beat it in probably 25 minutes or so, but yeah, this might be the game that I beat more than any other game in my entire life. I played through it so many times when I was a kid. It's just another one that I have a lot of nostalgia for. Maybe you guys disagree with me, maybe I'm blinded by nostalgia, but I do think this is one of the best co-op games of all time. If you haven't played Goof Troop, just do it, okay? It's a very approachable game. And now, before I get to number 1, I wanted to talk about a couple of newer games. The first one being New Super Mario Land. This is a fan-made game that was a remake of Mario Land on Game Boy, but it has new Super Mario Bros. Visuals and updated gameplay. And you could play it in 4-player co-op, which is just incredibly cool to see for the Super Nintendo. So if you could play this with 4 players, I highly recommend it. The next game I wanted to briefly mention is Nightmare Busters, and this is actually a game that was made back in the 90s, but it never was released. Luckily, a handful of years ago, someone got their hands on the game and finally released it to the public. It's a surprisingly solid 2D run-and-gun platformer, kind of like Metal Slug or Contra, but with some more cartoony visuals, I think. This one's really hard, but I do recommend it. Now, number 1. The best co-op game on Super Nintendo is Secret of Mana. It's an action RPG with a lot of depth, but the main standout feature is the 3-player co-op gameplay, which was very unique for its time. And just in general, seeing any story-based game that was based around co-op was unheard of back in the 90s, and each character plays a very important role in the game. You start out with 1 player. And as you progress forward, you have to find the other characters. And then other players are able to jump in once those characters join the party. So you can't play it co-op right from the start. But it won't take too long. The combat might take a little bit of getting used to, but once you get the rhythm of it, wait for your charge to get back to 100, and then attack again, it actually feels really good. The ring menu was incredibly innovative for its time. This is a really great RPG with so much depth. Not only is it one of the best Super Nintendo games, it's just one of the best co-op video games of all time. So that's why Secret of Mana has to be my number 1. Okay, so there are 30 co-op Super Nintendo games, plus a couple of homebrews. What's your favorite co-op Super Nintendo game? And if you enjoyed this video, check out our top 30 co-op Sega Genesis games video. And thank you for watching.